The morning I realized my husband had stripped away my agency, I was in Miriam Lapp's kitchen plunging my hands into cold water. A newborn had arrived with terrifying speed and an eerie silence. The infant emitted only a singular, damp gasp before falling completely still. I pressed my fingertips against the base of its skull, mimicking the precise technique my own mentor had taught me, searching for the delicate heartbeat that dictates whether your efforts will salvage a life or merely comfort a memory. Outside, frozen rain tapped rhythmically against the window pane. The room was thick with the scent of burning wood and the metallic, briny aroma that inevitably accompanies childbirth. My fingers caught the rhythm. The infant was alive. Yet, when I returned to my own home 4 hours later, my husband Jacob informed me that I was forbidden from crossing our threshold without his written authorization for the upcoming 6 months. He delivered this mandate with the flat, unbothered tone a man uses to note that the bread has finished baking, an absolute certainty already settled. I want to recount the events that followed that moment. To begin, let me share where I come from. I spent 23 years working as a midwife within an old order settlement located in Holmes County, Ohio. It was a closed community of 280 people who entrusted me with the most sacred vulnerability they hid from everyone else. I managed the thresholds of existence, the arrivals, the departures, and every hidden reality between those points that the modern world was never meant to witness. The experiences I accumulated at those bedsides ultimately made it impossible for me to remain. However, my departure took far longer than it should have. The delay occurred for the exact same reason my husband could issue that decree in our kitchen, fully aware that I possessed no means to challenge it. If you wish to continue uncovering the truths the midwife was forbidden from uttering aloud, consider connecting with this narrative and staying updated on future accounts. If you have reflections on these experiences, sharing your thoughts can help bridge the gap between our worlds. Now, it is necessary to explain the nature of this discipline. Within that community, a husband does not function as a partner. In fact, the language itself lacks a true equivalent for that concept. He is designated as the head. Throughout more than 2 decades of community life, I heard the bishop articulate this doctrine explicitly at every single wedding ceremony. The husband holds authority over the wife, just as Christ holds authority over the church. This concept is not treated as a mere symbol or an abstract spiritual philosophy open to personal interpretation. It functions as a rigid mandate. A wife must request formal approval to visit her sibling. She must seek permission to transport her children to a neighboring farm. She must obtain consent before accepting compensation for her needlework. Even a midwife, a woman whose responsibilities inherently demand unrestricted movement at any hour of the night, in bitter cold, or in the thick of an active delivery, operates under this structure. Her freedom relies on a sweeping authorization granted at the inception of her calling, an unspoken understanding because even the men recognize that a woman in labor cannot wait on a husband's whim. That foundational authorization was precisely what Jacob chose to rescind. In his mind, he had valid grievances. I had stepped outside the boundaries of his expectations in ways I will clarify. First, however, it is essential to understand the structural design of that environment, because the structure itself constitutes the narrative. A woman in that society possesses no financial assets that belong to her by law. She has no independent means of transportation. She must travel on foot or rely on someone else to drive her. She does not mail a single letter without her husband reviewing the contents beforehand. This does not happen because a written regulation demands it, but because the cultural expectation is so absolute that a formal rule is redundant. Over the years, I heard 3 different women utter the exact same sentiment with an identical tone of weary instruction. They explained that understanding was not required of a wife, only trust was. Comprehension belonged to the men, while compliance belonged to the women. The true toll of this social order is entirely hidden from external observers. To outsiders, it presents an illusion of beautiful simplicity. From the inside, it feels like trying to draw breath in a room where the ceiling sinks lower by an inch with each passing year. It was the latter part of November in 1998. I was 34 years old and had been bound to Jacob in marriage for 11 years. Our household included 3 children, aged 9, 7, and 4. The delivery that called me to Miriam Lapp's kitchen that morning marked the 3rd time I had responded to an urgent request in a span of 6 days. In Jacob's estimation, I had failed to properly prepare our home before my departures. He had returned to a cold, unlit stove on Tuesday. He discovered our youngest child still clad in nightclothes at midday on Thursday. On Saturday morning, the day of the lap delivery, I had slipped out into the darkness before he even woke because Miriam's sibling had pounded on our door at 4 in the morning, leaving no room for hesitation or delay. 3 perceived infractions resulted in a single unyielding sentence. When he laid out the restrictions, I placed my medical bag onto the table and told him that women would still go into labor in the dead of night, that they would call for me, and if I did not answer, they would be forced to seek someone else. He did not raise his voice. That is a detail that must be fully grasped. He was not a man given to yelling. He was simply a man who executed decisions. This quiet calculation was far more devastating than anger because it slammed the door shut before you could even attempt to protest. For the first week, I maintained a fragile hope that the restriction would lift. I composed a letter to the bishop, framing my thoughts as an inquiry regarding my spiritual obligations to the sick, but Jacob intercepted the paper before it could be delivered and threw it into the wood stove. This behavior was not born of overt malice, nor would he have categorized it as such. In his estimation, it was the enforcement of order. He revered order with the same absolute conviction I maintained when checking a newborn for a pulse, viewing it as the fundamental force that kept our world alive. On the 14th day of my restriction, Emma Troyer dispatched her eldest son to my doorstep. Emma was 22 years old and navigating her second pregnancy, following a highly traumatic initial birth. The young boy stood on my porch holding his hat in his hands, explaining that his mother had been struggling in labor since the previous evening and that the family specifically requested Rachel. I lingered in the doorway for a long moment. Jacob was out working in the barn. Behind me, my daughter was watching from the window. I reflected on my calling, on the capabilities contained within my own hands, and on the solemn commitment I had made to the women of our community. That promise existed long before my marriage, and, I believed, would endure long after it. I picked up my medical case. Without uttering a word to my daughter, I crossed the snowy yard, entered the barn, and told Jacob that Emma Troyer was in labor, and I was leaving to attend to her. Jacob put down his implements. He told me no. I looked at him and said yes. I wanted understood that I had never spoken to him with that specific tone before. It was a single, unyielding word, devoid of any defensive explanation. I turned, walked out of the barn, and headed down the road without casting a single glance backward. My hands remained perfectly steady until I passed the Yoder property line, and the house vanished from view. If this account speaks to something deep within you, sharing your own experiences or connecting with these truths helps validate what many carry in silence. These memories are burdens I bore out of that life, and sharing them is the only way to release their weight. Emma's child entered the world at midday, a healthy baby girl who let out a robust cry and clamped her tiny fingers firmly around my thumb the moment I placed it in her hand. Emma wept with sheer gratitude. I remained by her side for 2 hours after the delivery, maintaining my usual practice, and our conversation touched only on mundane things: the bitter weather outside, the infant's hair, and how the older siblings would react. Emma possessed a natural gentleness that defined her character. 6 months prior, she had sat at my kitchen table and confessed a deep, quiet dread regarding her husband. It was not a fear of physical violence, but rather a terror of vanishing entirely, of being minimized bit by bit until there was nothing left of her essence to fill her clothes. I carried the heavy weight of that confidence in my chest during the entire walk back to my home. Jacob was seated at the kitchen table when I walked through the door. He uttered only one declaration, telling me that I had stripped myself of this family's protection. I set my bag down and took a seat directly across from him, asking for clarification. He laid it out as a straightforward matter, because in his mind, it was entirely uncomplicated. He would no longer advocate for me if the bishop interfered. He would not stand beside me or speak on my behalf during community gatherings. He intended to inform the deacons explicitly that I had willfully violated a direct patriarchal order. He did not plan to banish me from the home, asserting that he was not a merciless man, but he would formally withdraw his covering. Within our culture, that specific term signifies a husband's spiritual and social shield, which dictates a wife's entire legitimacy within the community. Stripped of that shield, I was not legally exiled. I was merely left completely vulnerable and exposed. It was only much later, long after my departure, that I discovered a modern term for this specific environment. A counselor identified it as coercive control, defining it as a systematic pattern of behavior designed to strip a person of resources, social networks, and independence to compel total submission. She stated it with absolute clarity, much like pronouncing a word in a native tongue that you have spoken your entire life but only recently learned to spell. I had existed within that exact framework for 11 years without ever possessing a vocabulary to describe it. I had categorized it as matrimony. I had viewed it as religious devotion. I had accepted it as the immutable nature of existence, assuming life was identical everywhere, and had always been so. I lacked the awareness then that I possess today. The actions I took in the subsequent weeks were completely devoid of drama. There were no explosive confrontations, no theatrical arguments, and no singular moment of chaotic escape. Instead, I quietly began documenting everything in a small notebook. I recorded dates, specific phrases, and precise accounts of what privileges were being restricted and the justifications offered. I kept this notebook concealed inside my midwife kit because Jacob never had any reason to open it. He found the physical realities of childbirth and the human body entirely unappealing. Consequently, that medical bag functioned as the solitary private domain I possessed in the world. I wrote entries while sitting at bedsides, utilizing the quiet intervals between a mother's contractions in the dim light while the laboring women rested. I wrote down Emma's name. I recorded the concept of the covering. I documented the exact date I walked out of the barn in defiance. When the time came to leave the settlement behind, a narrative that requires its own dedicated space to be told properly, that small book was the sole possession I took with me. I still have it in my keeping. The exterior is a faded blue, frayed at the edges, and the latch was defective from the very day I acquired it. I rarely open it now. There is no need, as the contents are burned into my memory. The systematic isolation my husband enforced, the restriction of my physical freedom, and the deliberate stripping of my social standing as a penalty for independence would be recognized in many modern legal systems outside that community as a punishable offense under domestic abuse statutes. Secular society began criminalizing this behavior in 2015, with various regions slowly adopting similar legal protections. Yet inside our settlement in 1998, it was never viewed as misconduct. It was treated as sacred doctrine, the structured implementation of an order that had persisted for 3 centuries, believed by the community to be ordained directly by the Almighty. I am not suggesting that every individual within that society was malicious. That is simply not true. The women who delivered nourishment to families after a difficult birth possessed authentic tenderness. The men who gathered to repair a neighbor's roof during a downpour exhibited genuine selflessness. The spiritual tradition, in its quiet moments, held undeniable beauty. I have no desire to diminish that value for those who still find comfort in it. However, beauty and profound harm can inhabit the exact same structure. I arrived at that understanding at 34 years old, standing in my kitchen facing a man who harbored no anger, who possessed absolute certainty, and who believed with his entire being that his actions were necessary for my spiritual welfare, the protection of our household, the integrity of our faith, and the honor of God. That absolute conviction was the most devastating element to encounter. It eliminated any possibility for dialogue because it is impossible to reason with a person who believes they are acting on behalf of a higher power. To the best of my knowledge, Emma Troyer remains in Holmes County to this day. The baby girl I delivered for her would be 27 years old today. I am completely unaware of the trajectory of her life or whether she has found contentment. I have visualized that infant, remembering the fierce intensity with which she gripped my thumb, more times than I can count. She represents a path I am blocked from following, and I have trained myself to accept that disconnect. What I can state with certainty is that the notebook with the broken latch remains in my possession. I keep it close, not because it holds power over me anymore, but because I refuse to forget the sensation of having a single medical bag as my solitary refuge in the world. I will not let that memory fade. If these words strike a chord within you, consider sharing your own reflections or detailing your personal journey when the time feels right. Let me know what particular element of this account stayed with you. Knowing your thoughts reinforces the reality that the events of those hidden rooms do not belong to me alone to endure. You may have never set foot in an isolated Ohio settlement. Your upbringing might have unfolded in a sprawling metropolis, within an entirely different religious tradition, or inside a household that shared absolutely no similarities with my own. Yet, if you have ever been subjected to the claim that your independence, your individual expression, or your personal path belong to someone else to dictate, then you fully comprehend the reality I am articulating. You have carried that knowing within your own flesh. That shared understanding is the reason I am speaking now. There is a specific truth I have never allowed myself to utter aloud until this very moment, and I am going to speak it clearly. I was never a rebellious wife. I was simply a human being whose total compliance had been misidentified for 11 long years as the complete absence of an individual identity. The truths I carried out of that closed world are brought into the light here, ensuring that what transpired in the shadows is not permitted to remain there. Your autonomy belongs entirely to you. It always did.